Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Baruch na Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fi amcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tzeitzenu v'tzeitzei amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodea shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah le'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Okay.
Amen.
I'm just going to go through the Mishnah Berurah for one sec. All right. So this halacha is by Rabbi Daniel Brody on the Mishnah Berurah. It's in section 188, verse 2, and in the Shulchan Aruch it's on the 188, verse 1. And what we're discussing is the Amen of Bonei Yerushalayim. So basically, in the benching, we don't say Amen to our own brachas generally at all. However, the reason why we distinctively say Amen when we say it, like for example in the Mazuman, at the end of the third bracha of benching, when we say Bonei Brachamav Yerushalayim, and when we use the word Amen, is because we have to distinguish between the first three brachas, which are Daraisa, Torah-based, and the fourth bracha, which is Rabbinic in nature. So Darabanan, we're actually making a distinction there to show the significance and the difference. Actually, there was a time when we would actually say the Amen quietly, but today we say the Amen aloud, like any other Amen in a bracha when you say it as a group. When you say Amen, it should preferably not be in the same breath as the bracha, for then it would look like it's part of the bracha. So what you have to do is obviously say the bracha, pause and say Amen. So it's best to wait just a little bit of finishing between the word Yerushalayim and then saying Amen. You can also take a breath between them. But you should also not wait more than 2 or 3 seconds after finishing the bracha, because the Amen then would be a hefsek. It would be disconnected from the main body of the bracha, and that would be known as an orphaned Amen. Okay. Hi, Kev.
How's it? Sorry, just did you send this quick message? I'm listening. Okay.
No problem. All right. So we just did the halacha, and I'm going to start with the Gemara now. All right. So there's just a note I wanted to read to you guys. Give me 1 second. All right. So all I said to you guys is that the whole point of Sanhedrin 76b is trying to bring that, since we rule that the dog's owner is liable for biting, okay, it's proving that the dog's mouth is considered like the damaged or injured party's property, because the owner of the dog would not be liable if the dog's mouth was considered like the damage's property, because it's just like if somebody enters your property without permission, he can't sue you if he's injured there. Does that make sense, guys, in terms of what the Gemara is trying to bring?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, so explain it to me, Michael, and then we can fly
All right.
through.
So obviously the dog goes into another person's yard and it does something untoward. Okay. The dog. The dog is now considered to be like the in the yard of another. It's considered to be doing damage in the yard of another, even though so the damager is liable. So the damager is liable because, otherwise otherwise you would have a case where the dog's not considered as a dog's not a person, right?
Okay.
So you have to assign liability to it, and in order to do that, you've got to now make the dog as though if it took something, you've got to consider it as being doing damage in the yard of another. Not making quite sense. No.
No, it's okay.
Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah.
So to make the damage liable, because damage is not there. The damage is not there, and therefore,
Okay.
no. Yeah, it's a hard one, this, but I kind of get it. I don't know. Maybe I don't. Maybe someone else can give it a go.
Asking. I mean, anybody else have any thoughts?
Sorry, like the dog becomes a property. Sorry, the dog becomes like a property.
Okay, that is a valid point, but
the dog becomes like a property, and the dog is considered to be the damager in the property wherever it is. So the damager, even though it may be somebody else who owns the dog, is not liable. Okay, Gav, I don't know. You give it a go.
Gav, what's your thoughts?
So let me just see if I remember it. So the dog basically is that example with the dog, where the domain becomes the dog, and therefore the owner takes liability, is only in the case where a person put something in the dog's mouth, as opposed to the dog grabbing it itself. So if it's actually put in the dog's mouth, then that is the dog's domain, and the owner is liable. Good. But in most cases, that's not going to be the case. The dog is going to grab it himself, and therefore it's not his domain, and therefore he is in the territory of the damaged party, and therefore he's liable for the damaged party for whatever he consumed.
Good. What type of person is not liable, and why are they not liable, and what type of person is liable?
So somebody that's incompetent, somebody like me, puts it into the dog. Well, I thought I was a good example. All right, somebody's not quite competent. What did I say? Somebody's incompetent. So I'll upgrade it to somebody's not quite competent. That's me. Goes and puts it into the dog's mouth. Sorry, what was the question that you asked me? I'm in the right direction, but I don't know if I think I'm not.
You said the right thing. You said it clearly. So I want to break this up into 8 separate parts very quickly. Okay? 8. Step by step. There's 8 separate parts. Okay. So just quick step by step. So number 1, if we're not talking about a classic case of shame. What the Tosfot from Rabbi Cohen came to bring up is that there's no question that according to Tosfot, that where the animal eats the food is where there's liability. It's not where the animal took the food from. Rashi said it's where it took the food from. So if we're saying it's where it actually ate the food and not where it took it, if it ate the food in the same premise as where the food was grown or the food belonged, that's in the damaged or injured party's yard, at which you're culpable for shame for payment damages. Okay. Right. Now, we're talking in a case, as Gavin quite rightly, and it's not a case in a public domain, because in the public domain or in the damages yard, there is exemption, because we have to fulfill the verse that said, if he sends his animal forth in the yard of another, which is a biblical verse. So the biblical verse has nothing to do with logic. Biblical verses supersedes Torah, which is logic. That is the dictation principle. So in the public domain or the damager's yard, you're not liable. In the damaged or injured party's yard, basically the owner of the food, in that case, you are liable. How this whole case came was a case where we're saying, well, what happens if Arthur's buying food for all of us, Gavin brings the meat and I bring the biscuits, and the dog ate both of those things in Arthur's yard, you as the dog owner, Michael, are not liable to pay me for the biscuits or Gavin for the meat that the dog consumed. because it's not in our respective yards. It's in Arthur's yard because we were having a communal braai. That's how this issue came up, because we weren't sure what to do in like a yard where we were all like convening. Okay, so once it brought this whole issue about where, what's considered damage, and what I was going to say is that now we've established this case of where the animal is eating, according to Tosfot, that's the point of liability. It's bringing a case now. Well, since the animal is eating the food, and the food's in the animal's mouth, who does the animal belong to? The animal belongs to the person that pays the VAT bills because it's his dog. So then the question arose, and even if you want to hold according to Rashi, that it's where the animal took the food from, and that's the point of liability. It's still in the mouth of the dog at the point of consumption. So we're saying, is there a basis for saying that there is no liability in the mouth of the animal, since the person owned the animal? And Michael and I felt a bit of frustration about this originally, because we couldn't understand how, one could even think of such a thing, because that it's obvious from where we grew up in logic, is that if somebody comes to your premises and damaged something without your permission, or consumed something or took something without your permission, that obviously they'd be liable. So what do you mean there's no liability in the mouth of the animal when the animal took food from your particular place? So obviously the Tosfot that Rabbi Cohen found made it very clear that it was a case where Gavin quite rightly remembered, is somebody that does not have dias. Dias means they're not able to see consequence of the action, which would be either a mana, which is somebody young enough to halachically not be responsible for their actions. A kid, a child that's experimenting, that just takes his pet dog and then takes steaks from the fridge of somebody else and puts it in that dog's mouth. Does that make sense? He goes in the place and he puts in the meantime, you've got a bra coming up and you lost 400 rands worth of chops from Moishe's butchery. So in that case, that mana doesn't have any consequence. Why? Because he doesn't know what it's like to work or be responsible for money or see the financial loss in terms of an adult. The same with somebody that's mentally deranged or suffers from retardation, etc. Those sort of people are not responsible for their actions. Now, why did Rabbi Cohen use that as an example? Well, simply because if somebody is mentally competent and they put it in the mouth of a dog, they're now responsible to pay as the person that created that destructive act. That would be more of a case of maveh, where you don't have an indirect party involved. It's a mentally competent person at which you're responsible for full mu'at damages, as that person should have known better. So, okay, so we have a case of a mentally incompetent person, and I read some other commentary that we're not talking classically in a case of the the case. We're actually talking about the injured or damaged party's yard. And the reason we're saying this is there was an example afterwards brought by Rav Murray, the son of Kahana, and then Ravina, and a bar that came to explain Rav Murray. And it was saying that, well, how would you ever have a case of Shane in the private domain? In other words, if you exempt by calling the animal basically the property of the animal owner, and therefore it's in the premises of the damager. In other words, once it's in the mouth of the animal, it belongs to the owner, and therefore it's when it was consumed, it was the damager's property, and there's no liability. And we obviously saying there couldn't be any basis in the Gemara saying for such a discussion. It doesn't make any logical sense. And the Gemara is saying, well, actually there is, because, well, the Gemara is saying initially there wouldn't be, because you'd never find a case then where a person would be liable. Why? Because the minute it went into somebody else's yard and consumed, the minute it was in the mouth of the animal being consumed, the owner doing in my dog's mouth, meaning it's in my property. So then the Gemara wants to bring and play, what do you call it, opposites advocate, where it says, Rav Mari will say to you that you're still liable for tordos. What are the tordos? An animal rubbing against a wall. And it says, but it actually has to fulfill the verse, and the tooth, and it consumes until destruction. So Rav Mari says, well, very well. Then if you look at, if it doesn't knock over the wall, but rubs out a wall mural, which was fashionable in those days, and you can't see the image anymore, that's considered until its destruction. Or if it rolls about the hay with its back and destroys fruits and vegetables where it's embedded in the soil and you're not going to retrieve it, it's also considered until its destruction. So that's the way, obviously, Ravina explains it. And where Rav Ashi explains it on behalf of Rav Mari. The question I had is, what do you do with that first part of the verse that turns around and says, and the tooth consumes until its destruction? The very mention of the word tooth implies the av, which is Shane. And how do you suddenly have tordos that exist without the av? Especially when the tordos, the first question was by Rav Papa, do you pay as much as the av? All of a sudden the av doesn't exist. So that was my question on it. Anyway, in order to resolve an inquiry, it brings up Sanhedrin 76b. And in 76b, it wants to say, listen, there is no basis for this argument. And this is, Michael, where a little point where you need a little bit of clarity. Is the point where we basically say, how do we prove that it's not valid, that the animal's mouth belongs to the owner, and therefore it's the premises of the damage at which, if the dog bites somebody, the owner is not liable. So this is what it's saying. It brings a case of an inciter. Now, I'm inciting my dog. What we're saying is here, just in a nutshell, is that we want to prove that there's no such discussion as just because Marco owns his dog Paris, and since he pays for the dental bills and anatomy bills, that the minute the food's in the dog's mouth, that it suddenly becomes his possession, because the dog is his property. And how do we prove this? Is we took this case in 76b in Sanhedrin, where we said somebody incites a dog to bite a third party, and now Marco's the dog's owner, it would imply to be responsible. Now, if we're saying that the mouth, all it's trying to say is, if we're saying that the mouth of the dog becomes, if we're saying that the mouth of the dog is actually Marco's ownership, and therefore it's not responsible for biting anybody, just like the mouth of the dog Marco wouldn't be responsible for eating anybody. In that particular case, we're saying it's not true. The owner of the animal, the owner of the animal is fully liable for the bite that even a third party incites. Okay, so therefore proving that Marco is responsible for his dog's bites, meaning that the minute his dog takes its mouth over my hand and bites it, if Marco is responsible, we're proving that the mouth of the animal is not the domain of the animal's owner, just because of the anatomy of the dog belonging to Marco plays the vet bills of Paris's dog. So because Marco is then responsible to pay for the vet bills of his dog biting somebody else, even in the case it would seem of a third party, which is even more extreme, somebody else that incited his dog, it's proving then that the mouth of the dog or the mouth of any animal cannot be seen to be the damager's property, and it's seen to be considered the premises of the injured party or damaged party. So the Sanhedrin was just brought as a proof to that, because they're saying if somebody broke into Gavin's premises and one's dog attacked Gavin in Gavin's premises, Gavin is not liable because the person trespassed. So too, if the mouth of the animal is considered the property of the animal owner, then there wouldn't be a case of being responsible if your animal bit somebody, because it would be considered the premises or the property of the dog owner. And we're saying since the dog owner is liable to pay, then obviously a case is it doesn't make sense that the mouth of the dog would be considered the damager's property or the damager's yard. It would be considered the damaged or the injured party's yard.
Yes.
Otherwise, he wouldn't be liable to pay. So let's just quickly go on. Come learn a proof from the following Mishnah. If one cited a dog against a person or incited a snake against him, he is not liable. The Gemara explains who is not liable to pay damages to the injured victim. The Mishnah apparently means that the inciter is not liable, but the dog's master is liable. It uses that term and it comes to that conclusion because if it used the term and they are not liable to pay, it would mean both the inciter and the owner of the dog is not liable to pay. If it uses the word he is not liable to pay as the person that incited the dog against somebody else, it implies then that master's dog is liable to pay for the damages. Accordingly, the Gemara develops its proof. But if you say that the animal's mouth is treated as the damages yard, then why is the dog's master liable either? Let him say to the injured victim, what is your hand doing in my dog's mouth? So what that actually means is basically the it's a rhetorical way of saying that from a legal standpoint, the injured victim's hand has trespassed into the premises of the dog's master if the dog's mouth is considered belonging to the master. And if you trespass into the premises of the owner, it's a case where the dog's master is not liable to pay. So the very fact that the dog's master has to pay is proving that the dog's mouth is considered the injured or damaged party's yard. That's what it wants to bring here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what happens if you invite people over for Shabbos? So it's not trespassers, so it's friends of yours.
Yeah, that's not the discussion. The discussion is...
I'm adding something. No, I know the discussion is different.
Don't add. It's
enough as it is.
All right, just continue then.
Sorry, Butti. So what I'm saying is, here's the dog's mouth. If you say that since Michael pays for Paris's vet bills, his dog, and the mouth and the entire anatomy belongs to Michael, since he's the one that always covering the dog's cost for food and vet bills, then when his dog's of whom he owns is considered like his premises. So if the dog consumes food, what's already in the dog's stomach is considered, the Gemara wanted to propose, to be the premises now of the owner of the dog. And therefore, if the mouth consumes food or bites a hand, it's considered then to be the premises, once it's in the dog owner's mouth, to be part belonging to the dog's owner, and therefore isn't liable for payment. In other words, if it's considered the damages party's yard, you're not liable for payment, for consumption or for biting. But if it's considered the damaged party's yard, in other words, the animal has no specific meaning in terms of ownership. In other words, it's irrelevant who owns the dog. If somebody puts food in the dog's mouth, that's a minor or mentally incompetent, it's still considered. We're asking here, is there a case of liability where if a minor or somebody that doesn't know consequence puts food in Michael's dog's mouth, is Michael responsible for the payment? And that's why it brings the case of an inciter. When another party incites Michael's dog to bite somebody, in that particular case, it's like putting food in a dog's mouth that doesn't belong to you. When the dog reacts by eating that food, is Michael responsible for that payment of that food? Just like if somebody incites Michael's dog to bite, is Michael responsible for paying for that dog's damages? And if this Gemara is proposing, which it does, that yes, Michael is responsible for that payment as the dog owner, it's then bringing a case forward to say that it's considered then the damaged party's yard, because it means if you have a case for liability, it means it's that the person that owns the dog doesn't get off the hook by saying, well, it's my animal and the food now is in my animal, and it's like it's my property. I don't owe you. So the reason it brings the example of both inciter as a third party or somebody that is mentally incompetent that directly feeds the dog is it's a third party. We want to know if a third party gets involved and causes your animals to damage other people, but whether it's biting them or consuming their food, is the dog owner responsible? Because if we're saying that the mouth of the dog is considered like the damaged party's yard, it's a fancy or rhetorical way of saying you're responsible for payment. If we're saying it's like the damages yard, meaning it's Michael's property, and if a third party causes damage with Michael's property, then they're not. It's not the dog's owner is not responsible for damage. It's saying it's the equivalent of somebody trespassing into your property and with their chihuahua. So if their chihuahua breaks into your fence and comes and gets eaten by the Doberman, because they're considered in your domain, the dog owner is not responsible if the Doberman ate the chihuahua. So it's the same thing is like Tosfot is saying is suddenly your neighbor rocks up and says, listen, your dog pinched a whole lot of steaks and it's in your dog's mouth. You must pay me for the steaks. But the dog at that point is on Michael's premises, at which Michael can turn around and say, listen, at the end of the day, why weren't you looking after your food? What's it doing in my dog's mouth? Or even if it's not in Michael's premises, at the point at which it leaves the damaged party's domain, what is it doing in the dog's mouth? Meaning, is there liability or is there no liability for an animal when a third party gets involved with causing damage with an animal through either feeding it or inciting it to somebody else? Yeah.
Damon, is the dog, I know this might be a silly question, but forgive me. I just thought of it now. Is the dog considered like an incompetent or mentally handicapped person who doesn't realize what he's doing?
Yes, that's why the dog's owner is responsible. That's exactly why the dog's owner
is responsible. The dog doesn't know someone has to pay for the meat that it took.
Yes, I just want to quickly answer Kevin's question. That's exactly why we learned that case of a slave that causes his master damages of 100 manna a day by punitively creating damage because he doesn't like the person he's working for. In that case, we don't obligate one's property for causing damage. But in the case of an ox, we do, because he's not there to be punitive against his owner and because he's got no dice. So that's exactly why we pay for damages in the case of an animal, because an animal won't punitively try and damage its master by keying his neighbor's Porsche.